development and wider use of architectural technologies, such as the vault rib and the buttress, are not exclusively responsible for the birth of Gothic architecture in the central area of France, known as the Ile-de-France, in the middle of the 12th century. Gothic architecture was also the product of a composite of political, religious, and social transformations, and, most importantly, of the need to build new churches. The new impetus for church construction, of which Notre Dame in Paris is a direct product, took place at the time of the revival of royal power during the 12th century. Architectural renewal was also promoted by new religious orders, such as the Cistercians, that called for a return to the values of devotion and mysticism. Specifically, the Cistercians developed their own and very unique style. The extraordinary elevation of Gothic churches, despite the emphasis on decoration, manifests a desire to reach high into the world of God. In the 12th century, Paris imposed itself as the new intellectual capital of Europe and the birthplace of scholasticism, the philosophy of rationality. The Gothic style became the new architectural counterpart of this cultural revolution. We have no documents left that could testify to the intellectual discourse of the Parisian architects of the 12th century. But the facade of Notre Dame itself speaks a degree of mathematical order and proportion that could define it as a product of scholasticism. Its superimposed geometrical tiers, which are like cubic masses, contribute to this rational aspect. Only the arch framing the rows breaks the quasi-classical feeling of self-containment. The elaborate decorations of Notre Dame, common to all Gothic cathedrals, are intended to bring on the outside of the church and to translate into stone the traditional work of the goldsmiths for the altars. As the most sacred elements in a church, altar decorations, when repeated on the outside, stress the sacredness of the entire construction. Notre Dame defines the Parisian landscape. It soars high and proud, a monument to a newborn civilization, from the island on the Seine on which it was built. The construction of Notre Dame began in 1163, and its height approached the elevation of some later churches. The width to height proportions of the central vessel are 1 to 2.5. It is 33 meters, or almost 110 feet, high. Chartres, the best known of all French Gothic cathedrals, was begun in 1194 over the ashes of a prior basilica. Terrain limitations constrain the cathedral in its length, a factor which is partially compensated by the large transept with its two beautiful facades. Each arm of the transept is flanked by two towers, adding to the monumental aspect. Of particular interest at Chartres are the outdoor sculptures. The tympanum of the central door of the west front, or the old portal, shows Christ in glory, flanked by the Ascension and by the Virgin in majesty. The statues of the south portal also display a great interest in detail. Particularly important at Chartres are the stained glass windows of the Roses and of the Clerestory. Between those sculpted and those painted, there are about 10,000 figures at Chartres. Gothic architecture would not have been possible without the technical breakthroughs that permitted it to evolve beyond the achievements of Romanesque architecture. The Romanesque church that we see here is a self-contained weight-bearing structure. Elevation is not one of its main features. By bringing to its ultimate consequences some Romanesque building principles, Gothic architecture challenges gravity with its upward thrust obtained with paper-thin walls and a story of glass windows. This was largely made possible by the use of the vault rib, not only as a strengthening device, but as a system through which lateral thrusts could be converted into vertical ones. Gothic architecture was very experimental, with everything aimed at upward development. The church rests on large piers, and the piers are followed by the responds, and these by the transverse and diagonal ribs of the vaults. Most importantly, height was made possible by the flying buttress, a half-arch placed outside the church with the purpose of pushing inward. Gothic architects made marvels with the flying buttresses. The Cathedral of Amiens is a wonderful example of the integration of the buttress in the whole unit. Begun in 1220, the Amiens Cathedral seems to be the realization of sculptor Auguste Rodin's ideal Gothic cathedral. Harmony in the living body is the result of a counterbalancing of masses in movement. The cathedral is built as an imitation of the living body. Its equilibrium follows the order of nature, the basic rules of all things, wrote Rodin. The flourishing of Gothic architecture also coincides with the extended use of the pointed arch and of the pointed arch vault that, like the semicircular arch, distributes the weight on its springings, but that also transforms lateral thrusts into vertical ones. The pointed arch can also cover rectangular spaces. The combined use of the pointed arch, of the buttress, and of the flying buttress with pinnacles and cuspids creates the miracle of Gothic architecture. These features make possible the great upward developments. The Cathedral of Amiens is 43 meters high, 10 more than Notre Dame. With the vaults resting on the piers, lateral walls were relieved of their structural function. With time, this brought about the attempt to eliminate any trace of the lateral walls, whose windows became larger and larger. the ideal of the glass church was becoming a reality. The substitution of the lateral wall with glass is visible in the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which gives the appearance of a frail glass structure about to crumble at first touch. The Sainte-Chapelle was built in the 13th century by Pierre de Montry for King Louis IX, Saint Louis, to enshrine the crown of thorns and other relics brought back from the Crusades. The Sainte-Chapelle is actually composed by two chapels united by a spire. This chapel shows the impressive developments of the style from, for example, the Soissons Cathedral, which is typical of the earlier Ile-de-France Gothic style. The starting point of Gothic architecture is considered to be the new choir for the Church of Saint-Denis, made in 1140 to 1144. King Louis VI, who instituted the custom of depositing the crown for coronation at Saint-Denis, was particularly generous with its abbot, Suger, who was mainly responsible for the renovation of the church. Gothic architecture's partiality to rich decoration contrasts with the simplicity of the Cistercian style, as seen here in the Church of Citeaux in Burgundy, where St. Bernard entered the Cistercian order. Like Gothic, the Cistercian style spread over Europe. We see here the Abbey of Fossanova in Italy. At about the same time, both styles spring from the Romanesque. But while Gothic prizes decoration, the Cistercian style goes in the opposite direction, in observance to St. Bernard's denial of any form of decoration. St. Bernard believed that decoration distracts from the contemplation of God. From a technical point of view, the Cistercian style uses the ribbed vault in a mechanical manner. It is repeated endlessly from church to church without much modification. On the contrary, Gothic architects would look at the ribbed vault in the same way that a sculptor would look at a piece of marble, a medium for artistic creation. Cistercian architecture is repetitive, Gothic creative. The Gothic architect is at once a mathematician, an engineer, and an artist, for whom the church is the realization of an individual vision. Artistically, each Gothic cathedral is a unique masterpiece and not the reproduction of a fixed module. It is like a huge landscape sculpture that thrusts upwards, expressing spirituality, ingenuity, and mastery. Are not those supreme aspirations of architecture the same as those of sculpture? Wrote Auguste Rodin in his book on Gothic architecture. The sculptor, who takes his models from the shapes of material life, from the flora, the fauna, from men and women, is certainly well served by this great variety of all this beauty. In the final analysis, the sculptor, like the architect, shapes light and shadow and turns them into sculpted stone. Sculpture is but a genre within the vast realm of architecture, and we should speak of sculpture as a type of architecture. If Notre Dame is the queen of cathedrals, the Reims Cathedral is the cathedral of kings, because it was here that the coronations of the French kings were held. The cathedral was begun in 1211, and many of the major architects of the time worked at its construction. The massive architecture of this cathedral is disguised by the windows, by the moldings, and by the open structure of the flying buttresses surmounted by pinnacles and spires. The Reims Cathedral is one of the most decorated. The 19th century architect, Viollet-le-Duc, noted in a study that the Reims statues are made so as to be subjected to optical correction, with the statues on the high pinnacles having very short arms and very long necks, so as to look normal to the viewer in the street. In this anticipation of the rules of perspective, which were to be fully developed and established in the Renaissance, Gothic architecture confirms its scientific and experimental drive. While certainly the Gothic period was rooted in the Middle Ages, it also displayed clear signs of the onset of new developments. The experimental aspect of its church architecture can be read today as an indication that the Middle Ages were about to finish, and a new great age of discovery in all fields of human endeavor was about to begin.